So good morning. My name is Michael Dampiero. I'm the Water Resources Agent with UF IFAS Extension in Sarasota County. And today we are going to be learning all about ponds. Extension is a partnership between Sarasota County, the University of Florida, and the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Essentially, what we do is take the information, the research, and the resources from the university, and we get that out to the public where you are. So we take all of that information, we take all of those resources, and we meet the community to get this information out to everybody. Okay, so I'm sure you're all here to answer this first question, but what is a stormwater pond? This is the first thing that we need to answer in order to understand these systems. A lot of people will be very happy to say that they live on a lake. We hear this a lot. A lot of people talk about the lakes in their community. The lake is beautiful. There's a problem with the lake. That is a little bit of a misnomer. So a lot of times people get a lot of value out of living on these water features. So people love to live by the water. You know, obviously the waterfront property is a hot commodity in any community. People often pay a premium to live waterfront. So it can be pretty disappointing when some things start to happen in the water itself that may be disrupting the aesthetics or the view. And many residents, HOA board members, and even the property managers may not have a full understanding of what these features are. And people will often mistake these features for natural lakes. The picture on your screen is a beautiful lake. It's nice and blue, grass right up to the bottom. And that may not necessarily be what you see in your community. Because there is a bit of a difference between this and what you see in your neighborhood. This is a natural lake, so it's much larger, much deeper, and just generally different from what we're going to be talking about today. So odds are pretty good that the water feature in your community is not a lake, but is actually a stormwater pond. There is debate over the definition of whether or not there are any true lakes in Sarasota County. The one outstanding feature that may be a natural lake, depending on who you talk to and how they define it, is Lake Myakka, and potentially Big Hole out in Myakka River State Park as well. But as far as these little lakes in pocket parks and communities, these are actually stormwater ponds. They are there for stormwater management. They are really important features of the community, not only for aesthetics and increasing property value, but also for some real world applications. The primary purpose of a stormwater pond is to collect stormwater and help to mitigate flooding during times of intense rainfall. That is their number one purpose, is to help prevent that flooding. Their secondary purpose is water quality improvement. So these stormwater ponds hold stormwater runoff, and they help to provide a level of treatment before that stormwater is released downstream to our receiving waters. And then in addition to those two planned benefits, we also have the benefit of habitat value, wildlife, and pleasing aesthetics from a well-managed pond. That caveat is important to keep in mind as we move forward. Okay, so first we need to understand a little bit of the anatomy of a stormwater pond and how these features work. So as I mentioned, the primary purpose of these stormwater ponds is to capture stormwater runoff. So you can see the picture on your screen. This is just a little bit of an illustration, very basic on how these stormwater ponds function. You have the drains that are along the side of the road in your community. There is sometimes misunderstanding about these drains. People may be under the impression that storm drains may lead to a water treatment system, the wastewater system, to a treatment plant. Here in Florida, that is not the case. We get too much rainfall for us to be able to combine our stormwater and our sewer systems. We would just be overwhelmed, and we can't always predict the intense rainfall. So these storm drains actually go to the nearest body of water to collect that stormwater runoff. And often, especially in modern development, the nearest body of water is going to be the community stormwater pond. So as water runs off of hard surfaces, that water is going to enter storm drains and be transported by a series of pipes to the nearest pond. It's also very common for these ponds to be interconnected one to the next by a series of pipes. This is particularly common in our larger communities and larger neighborhoods, especially if your community boasts having a lot of lakes and a lot of ponds. Those ponds are likely connected one to the next by a series of underground pipes. So what will happen in one pond can potentially impact what happens in a nearby pond. We can also sometimes see that ponds that are further down in the chain may have some additional issues because those ponds are sort of accumulating the water from a larger area as it moves through the system. And it's really important to remember that all of the water that ends up in these ponds, again, does not go to a water treatment facility, but is ultimately in one way or another discharged to receiving waters. And that is either through direct discharge through an outflow pipe or by subsurface, lateral, or vertical infiltration. We have a couple terms here, retention pond and detention pond. These terms are typically used interchangeably, and people will use either term to really talk about any sort of wet stormwater system, but there are specific definitions to both of these terms. It's not critical for our purpose here, but it is, still good to have an understanding of how these two systems are different. So we'll start with a retention pond. If you look at the schematic on your screen, it shows a bit of the water movement through a retention pond. So in a retention pond, the water is not necessarily transported off-site through a series of pipes. It's going to be more of a closed pond system, and the water is going to be retained until it slowly percolates through either vertical or horizontal infiltration through the soil. We also have detention ponds. Detention ponds are going to slow the stormwater, and they're going to eventually let that stormwater exit through an outfall structure. So eventually the water is going to be moved through a pipe that releases the water from the detention pond. It's easy to remember the difference between a retention pond and a detention pond if we reach back and start thinking about our experience in high school. If you are ever held for detention, you're held for a relatively short period of time. You're just held for a couple hours after class. But if you are retained a grade, you are held for a much larger time. You are retained for the year and asked to repeat the grade. So again, a detention pond holds water for a much shorter period of time than does a retention pond. And there can be pros and cons to either one of these. Detention ponds, in theory, may be a bit better for flood mitigation, where retention ponds, in theory, may be a bit better for water quality improvement. But either way, the water will at some point exit these systems towards receiving waters. We also have online and offline ponds. This refers a bit more to the way the ponds are constructed in relation to where they lie in a series and how they interact with other ponds in a series of a stormwater system. If you look at the schematic on your screen, you can see that the online pond has an inflow and an outflow in line with one another throughout the pond. And that functions by allowing the overflow from the pond to then exit and either continue moving down towards surface waters or to move to the next pond in a series of ponds. That's going to allow the pond to fill to a specified volume. And once the water reaches that specified volume through either a weir or an outflow structure, that water is then going to be transported out of the pond. So any overflow or any additional water is going to be allowed to move out of the pond at that point. That differs from an offline pond. An offline pond is essentially going to shut itself off from receiving water once it's full. So if you look at the offline pond, you'll notice that it does not have the overflow structure that the online pond does. It is only connected in one way, and you can see that it's sort of aligned a bit differently on the chain of the water flow and is labeled bypass. That's because once that pond is full to capacity, instead of having an overflow structure that allows the water to exit the pond, it's just going to be full to capacity, and it's no longer going to be able to receive any water from that lateral line. And then in that case, the water is then going to bypass that pond and move on downstream to likely a next pond in a series. You may be familiar with some of these structures along your community ponds. We have culverts and outflow structures. The outflow structure is what I was referring to in the last slide that really demands the volume of the pond. That's what's going to control the volume of the pond. It is a volume control structure, and it functions by allowing the water to exit once it reaches a certain level. So once it reaches the entrance to that outflow structure, the water is going to be allowed to exit, and the level will be maintained at the top of that outflow structure. Similarly, we have culverts. Culverts are going to be those sort of horizontal or tilted A-shaped looking concrete structures. You'll often see these entering a pond, and these are where water can move around different structures. So it's going to move likely under a street or underground and is going to connect ponds from one to the next. You'll often see these where water will enter a stormwater pond. So that can be a sign as to where the inflow of the stormwater pond is. Okay, so that is a bit how these structures work to capture runoff. So let's start talking about runoff itself. Runoff refers to any water that runs across the ground surface or other hard surfaces. And this usually occurs when rainfall or other water falls on impervious surfaces. And impervious refers to any surface that does not allow for the infiltration or the sinking down of water. So this is going to be any hard surface like asphalt, concrete, traditional stone pavers, even rooftops, or anything that does not allow water to sink down through it. Those surfaces are going to be incredibly prone to runoff during rain events, or even in the case of excess irrigation or improper irrigation, things like washing a car. Those situations are going to allow the water to run over those hard surfaces and take with it potentially anything that's in its path. But it's not only impervious surfaces that can produce runoff. We can have runoff produced by pervious or natural surfaces as well. So if you think of your own front yard with turf or ground cover, that can potentially lead to runoff as well, even though it may not necessarily be a hard impervious surface. So we see this typically with two different scenarios. One is when the soil is highly compacted. Due to our current construction practices, we often see compacted soil around development. That is because the soil that is used to build up your home's foundation is likely taken from a borrow pit, actually taken from when the stormwater pond is dug, or is taken in from an off-site location. And that is used to build up the foundation around a home so that you're a little bit above grade during times of intense rainfall. But unfortunately, in that process, the soil is compacted and the airspace is squeezed out of the pores of the soil. And then that is only further compounded by things like heavy construction equipment driving over the soil during the construction process. Compacted soil is much more difficult for water to pass through than is nice uncompacted loose soil. So in times of intense rainfall or other events, that rainfall can move across the compacted soil and contribute to runoff, and that can take with it anything that's on the lawn. We also see this happen when soil is already saturated. If you think of your front yard as a sponge, if we are getting a large, fast amount of rainfall, that soil in theory is only going to hold so much. So any additional water has the ability to run across the surface. You'll also often see this sort of ponding up on low front yards, running off into the street. And again, that can take with it anything that's on your front yard. Irrigation can also contribute to runoff. We see this a lot out in the field. People will have their irrigation heads improperly placed and spraying out onto impervious surfaces. Uh, you really don't need to be watering your driveway or your sidewalk or the street. They will be just fine without the sprinklers, I promise you. So the irrigation should really be targeted only on the turf or ornamentals or whatever it is that you're targeting with the irrigation. It should not be allowed to run off over these impervious surfaces. This can be particularly important if your community utilizes reclaimed water for irrigation purposes, and that is because reclaimed water is treated domestic former wastewater. That means that it is water that comes from the wastewater system, from homes and businesses, and is treated, sanitized, clarified, almost to the point of drinking water standards, but we're not quite there yet. And then that water is used for irrigation to help take pressure off of our potable water supply and also to help eliminate any surface water discharges. So it's a great, fantastic tool for water conservation, but that does have the caveat that reclaimed water contains residual nutrients, namely nitrogen and phosphorus. And those are the same components that are in fertilizers that allow plants to effectively and efficiently grow. They are nutrients for plants. And that refers to both terrestrial plants like turf and also aquatic plants like algae. Algae are aquatic plants. So if we are introducing excess nutrients, we are giving that ambient, naturally occurring algae the food that it needs to grow. So irrigation, particularly reclaimed irrigation, is just something that we need to be mindful of, that we're not spraying it out onto the streets, we're not using it in excess, and we're certainly keeping it away from stormwater drains. You can see in the pictures on your screen, this is from a home that I visited. The irrigation water, and this was reclaimed water, is traveling down the driveway. From the driveway, it's traveling down the curb, and from the curb, it's traveling directly into a stormwater drain. And that stormwater drain was leading to a pond just in back of that house. As runoff moves across the landscape and across our impervious surfaces, it does have the potential to take with it any pollutants that it has in its path. And this can be any number of things. And when it is taken up in the stormwater runoff, that runoff may eventually enter a storm drain and again directly into either a pond or our surface waters, bringing with it any sort of variety of pollutants that it can pick up on its way. And this can include things like fertilizer pellets, pesticides, vegetative debris, and grass clippings. They may not necessarily be something we think of as traditional pollutants, but as they decompose, they can add nutrients and organic matter to a water system. So they are pollutants in this situation. Pet waste is certainly a pollutant. Litter, so any sort of plastic debris that's on the road, that can make its way into the water system from stormwater runoff. Metals can be contributed. This is something we typically don't think of, but there are metals that can be deposited on a roadway, largely from brake dust. I am in no way telling you not to use your brakes. Please continue to use the brakes on your car. But just because of how brakes function, those metal discs are being compressed in order to make your brakes work. And as those discs are compressed, you get friction, and the friction causes or can cause small particles of metal to be released during that process. So that metal can be deposited on the roadway, and after a rain, those metals can be washed into a nearby stormwater system. We also have soil listed as a pollutant. Again, this is something that we don't typically think of as a pollutant, but soil can be a pollutant. Here in Southwest Florida, our soil tends to be particularly rich in phosphorus. So by adding silt and soil to a stormwater system through runoff, we can be contributing to the amount of phosphorus in a stormwater system, which again is a nutrient that can be utilized by plants for growth. Soil, particularly fine soil, can also have impacts on water clarity. So if there's a lot of silt that is entering a stormwater system, that silt can remain suspended for a time and block light from getting to the bottom of the water column. And blocking light can starve our beneficial aquatic plants for sunlight. And as we know, plants rely on sunlight for photosynthesis. So if we block that light, they may not be in too good of a state. We talked about grass clippings a bit. It's actually part of Sarasota County Code to not allow these grass clippings into a stormwater system or to remain on an impervious surface. And that is because grass clippings do contain some level of nitrogen. Grass clippings are thought to contain about 3 to 5% nitrogen by wet weight, which doesn't sound like too much, but if you think of the amount of grass clippings that are produced on any day, if they enter the water system, they can be contributing a significant amount of nitrogen. So Sarasota County Code states that in no case shall grass clippings, vegetative material, and/or vegetative debris, either intentionally or accidentally, be washed, swept, or blown off into stormwater drains, ditches, conveyances, water bodies, or roadways. We also hear a lot of people concerned about excessive algal growth. Algae is a natural part of the aquatic ecosystem. It is actually an integral part of the aquatic ecosystem. It forms some of the base of the food chain, and it does belong in our water environment. But algae can also become out of balance. So that naturally occurring algae can grow a bit out of control. So the situation like you see on the right of your screen can be indicative of a algae imbalance. And algae, again, does feed on nutrients. So algae is a plant. It utilizes the sun for sunlight and photosynthesis. It utilizes phosphorus and nitrogen for nutrients, and it uses those nutrients to grow and multiply. And that can lead to some water quality impairments and water quality concerns. In times of low oxygen, that can result in things like fish kills. It may be counterintuitive that algae can deplete oxygen since it is photosynthetic, but there are some situations when it can. So algae grows and multiplies very quickly. And as algae is growing, the older cells are also dying off. And those cells that are dying off will remain in the water column and begin to decompose. And that decomposition process can take up the ambient dissolved oxygen that's in the water and start to deplete levels of oxygen, which can harm wildlife. We can also sometimes see that algae can deplete oxygen during cloudy or low light conditions. So algae is photosynthetic and it will produce oxygen when it is in the presence of sunlight through photosynthesis. But when algae is starved for sunlight, it can potentially take up oxygen. So if we have a large algae bloom during a hot summer sunny day or series of days, and that's followed by times of very heavy cloud cover, rainy conditions where the algae is not getting sunlight, that can start to take up dissolved oxygen in the system and lead to dissolved oxygen depletion. That tends to happen when the water is warm. Algae does like to thrive in warm environments. And that is sort of a perfect storm because warm water will hold less oxygen just by nature. So there's really a couple different factors that can lead to dissolved oxygen depletion. Largely when there are fish kills in a community pond, that is the result of oxygen depletion, or sometimes just a severe cold snap. It's usually not the result of something like a chemical spill or chemical application. It's typically either a temperature or an oxygen issue. One of the things that's really important to keep out of the stormwater system is pet waste. People may like to walk Spot or Fido around the pond, and they may not be picking up after their friends. It's really important to pick up after your pet, and that's because the pet waste not only contains nitrogen and phosphorus, which again are those nutrients that can be entering the stormwater system, but pet waste also has the potential to contain parasites and pathogens. So you have some additional concerns with that pet waste entering the stormwater system. That is similar to failing or disrepaired septic systems. Septic systems can contribute nutrients and pathogens to a stormwater system. So what can you do to help maintain a healthy, well, to help to reduce some of the pollution in stormwater systems through runoff? You can keep your irrigation from spraying on impervious surfaces. IFAS Extension Sarasota County does offer a free irrigation evaluation service where we will come out and check your irrigation system for that overspray as well as some other things. You can fertilize appropriately and keep fertilizer off of impervious surfaces. You can consider installing a buffer of native plants around your community stormwater pond. You can keep grass clippings away from impervious surfaces. Absolutely pick up after your pet. Follow the 9 principles of Florida-friendly landscaping. You can consider installing a rain barrel as a way that you can collect stormwater runoff for reuse on your property rather than allowing it to run off into the water system. You can also invest in a downspout diverter. A downspout diverter can take the rush of stormwater coming out of your downspout and divert that into several small streams that are less likely to cause erosion and runoff. Okay, so now that we talked a bit about runoff, let's get into the littoral zone of a stormwater pond. The littoral zone is the shallow area of a stormwater pond that is going to be around the inside perimeter of a pond, and you may have what's known as a littoral shelf, which is a very wide littoral area. Sometimes that's going to be concentrated along the outflow of a pond. These areas are typically about 5 feet in depth or less, and that shallow depth allows for the light to penetrate through the water column to the bottom. And as we just talked about, that light is going to allow for photosynthesis and the growth of our beneficial aquatic plants. You can see that we have several different varieties of plants in the picture from the Aquatic and Invasive Plants Center. So we have our immersed or emergent plants. Those are going to be the plants that have their roots in the bottom of the substrate. They grow with their stems up through the water column, and then they have a large protruding stem and leaves and sometimes flowers up through the top of the water out in the air. We have our free-floating plants. Those are going to be plants that float along the water surface and allow their roots to dangle in the water column. We have our floating leaved plants. These are going to be things like water lilies and spatterdock. They have their roots anchored in the substrate of the pond. They have a long leading stem that will lead up through the water column. It's usually a very flexible stem. And then they will have a leaf that floats on the water surface. We also have our submersed or submerged plants. Those are going to be plants that are entirely under the water column. So they have their roots, their stems, their leaves, and even their flowers under the water. And notice that in this ecosystem, we again have algae. So just a reminder that algae is a naturally occurring part of our Florida aquatic ecosystem. That's important to remember. We'll often have people ask why their littoral zone is full of weeds. This is an unfortunate perception because a lot of these littoral plants are beneficial native plants that were intentionally installed by the community or the developer, sometimes at pretty large cost. So they are definitely not weeds, but we do see that these littoral zones can be overtaken by invasives. Any sort of reputable pond management company should be able to help you maintain the look and aesthetic of your littoral zone. And the emergent native plants in the littoral zone are thought to offer a lot of benefits for your pond. And that includes helping to buffer surface wave energy. A lot of erosion that can occur along the pond banks is the result of that gentle wave action across the surface of the pond. And that wave action, although it doesn't look like much over the years, can really lap away at the shores and contribute to significant erosion. The littoral emergent plants can help to deflect and shield your banks from that wave energy. It can sort of block that energy before it impacts the banks of the stormwater pond, and it can help to stave off some of that erosion. It can sometimes improve the absorption and removal of some pollutants. That's something that the university has been researching over recent years. It can help to hide algae from view. That is really great benefit of these littoral emergent plants. That allows for the presence of some algae in the stormwater pond because, again, that's part of the aquatic ecosystem. And algae is also thought to contribute to the uptake of these nutrients. So it does belong in the stormwater system, but it can be unsightly. So these littoral emergent plants can help to hide that algae from view while allowing it to remain in the stormwater system without taking away from the aesthetics, because your eyes are going to go right to the plants. And if the algae is sort of in and among those plants, you're not necessarily going to see it. It can provide habitat for birds and other desirable wildlife. A lot of our residents love to watch the birds that come into their stormwater ponds. And it can enhance the general overall ecological function of your stormwater pond by helping it to be closer to a natural system. And lastly, it can dramatically improve the aesthetics of your stormwater pond. So I don't know about everybody on the call, but personally, I really prefer the look of a pond that is heavily planted, looks sort of like our native Florida wetlands, and really gives you that feeling of being in South Florida. We have a couple common plants that we see around most of our planted stormwater pond. Those include things like pickerel weed with a purple flower, duck potato with a white flower. Golden canna will like to grow in the shallower areas of a stormwater littoral zone, and that produces a beautiful yellow flower. And we also see a lot of spike rush, and spike rush is sometimes mistaken for grass, but it's actually a bit different. That is a short rush that grows in stormwater ponds. That is great for growing in a stormwater pond that may be giving you difficulty in establishing some of these other plants. The spike rush tends to be more robust, more vigorous of a grower, and it can survive in some of the conditions where these plants may not be taking hold. It's important, though, to maintain diversity in your littoral zone. This is just a general principle that we see throughout landscaping. It's usually better to stay away from monocultures and to have more diversity in any system. That's for a number of reasons. In addition to having increased habitat value, that also helps give a layer of protection against disease pressure and pests, because if a particular pest comes in and wipes out all of one species that is planted very closely to one another, you'll then have other species that are still there that may potentially not be affected by that same pest. All right, so those are the plants that grow along the inside perimeter of the pond. Now it's time to talk about the plants that grow along the outside perimeter of the pond. We refer to this as the buffer zone. A buffer zone is a vegetated area adjacent to a pond intended to require minimal maintenance and reduce external pressures on the pond. So these are going to be the plants that grow on the outside perimeter or the bank area of your pond. And we see this in two different ways. We see this as landscaped buffer zones, and commonly throughout Sarasota, we see this as what's called no-mow zones or low maintenance zones. And these zones are meant to reduce external pressures on the water. And external pressures can include anything along the lines of mowing, fertilizer application, pesticide application, excess irrigation, pollutants carried in runoff, vegetative debris, and litter contained in runoff as well. Sarasota County, through its ordinance, strongly recommends the presence of a 6-foot low maintenance buffer zone along all water courses, including stormwater ponds. But unfortunately, that is not mandated. It is just highly recommended. And that is one of the best management practices that we also highly recommend at Extension. And part of the code states that no vegetative material shall be deposited or left remaining in this zone or the water. Sarasota County ordinance prohibits the use of fertilizer within 10 feet of any stormwater pond. So that's really important to keep an eye out for. There should be no application of fertilizer within 10 feet of any pond, as according to Sarasota County ordinance. And this is known as the ring of responsibility, which is a green industry's best management practice. The Florida Friendly Landscaping Program also recommends against mowing, fertilizing, or applying pesticide within 10 feet of a stormwater pond. So we often see very short no-mow zones along stormwater ponds, but luckily Sarasota County ordinance does really recommend installing a 6-foot buffer zone around stormwater ponds. There are some benefits of these bank buffer areas, and one of them is runoff interception. It can help to prevent large litter items from entering the stormwater pond. If you look at the picture on your screen, you can see some snack bags and pieces of plastic that are being blocked by what looks like some native bunch grasses before it was able to enter the pond. That's something that we see very commonly with these landscaped buffer zones. We'll see things like plastic bags, plastic bottles trapped in the buffer zone where they can easily be picked up before they enter the water. It's a lot easier to get trash out of a buffer zone than it is to get trash out of the middle of a pond. These buffer zones also help to prevent against erosion. So we have the littoral plants in the water that can help prevent erosion. And then if that's coupled with a bank buffer zone, you could potentially be in a really good spot to protect against erosion. That is because these plants, once they're allowed to grow taller, so if you're allowing your turf to grow taller, or if you're utilizing native bunch grasses, we're going to be working towards developing a more robust root system than traditional short-cropped turf. And this is particularly prevalent with our tall native bunch grasses. So something like cordgrass, or what's in the picture on your screen is muley grass, one of my personal favorites. Those tall grasses are going to be able to produce much more developed root systems, much more robust root systems than traditional turf. And those robust root systems are really going to work to help anchor the soil in place and hold that soil in place so that it's not washed away by that wave action that we talked about earlier. So again, if you have those littoral plants in the water and you pair that with something like a buffer zone on your screen, you could be at a really good place for helping to prevent erosion in your community pond. It also adds aesthetics. So if we look at some of those grasses that are along the pond, especially muley grass, again, which is my personal favorite, it begins to bloom in the autumn. It's really beautiful and adds a very nice, purposely landscaped aesthetic and touch to a community stormwater pond. And there are many different plants that can be selected. Over at IFAS Extension, Sarasota County, we have a bunch of resources for helping you choose appropriate plants. And those plans can be curated by your landscape management company to really fit the look and feel that's desired by your community. We can also have some increased habitat value from these buffer zones. So a well-managed buffer zone of native plants can provide habitat for local wildlife by bringing in insects and pollinators and those birds that we all love to watch. And as I mentioned, we typically see these buffer zones in two different styles when we look throughout Sarasota County. We see no-mow zones, and we can also see some landscaped buffer zone. There are some important differences to consider between these two options. A no-mow zone is going to allow existing turf grass to grow to a height of 8 to 12 inches. It's going to be able to be quickly implemented because there's already likely turf grass around the pond. You're only allowing that to grow taller and maintaining that. There's going to be no or low cost to implementation because, again, that turf grass is likely already existing. But however, those no-mow zones can become unruly without regular maintenance and weed removal. They are low maintenance zones. They are not no maintenance zones. They still do need to be maintained. They need to be trimmed at a height of about recommended 8 to 12 inches using a string trimmer while being careful not to get the grass clippings in the pond. That can be a bit of a challenge. They also need to be regularly weeded. By allowing that turf grass to grow taller, you may start to notice things that were existing in the turf grass that you did not notice before you allowed it to get taller. So they do require that regular maintenance to remove weeds. We also see landscape buffer zones. A landscape buffer zone can provide more of an intentional landscape aesthetic when we are looking at things like that muley grass around the stormwater pond. That gives much more of an intentional landscape feature feel. It allows for an opportunity to add more native and Florida-friendly plants to the landscape. We always advocate for adding more native and Florida-friendly plants to a landscape. But it does require proper site preparation to remove weeds prior to planting. That is important for removing any invasive species or prevalent weeds that may be in the seed bank under the buffer zone. And this can be pretty costly, both the labor, the preparation, and the purchase of plants. But luckily, there are several local grants that may be available to assist with the purchase of the native plants. So there are funding options that are available to the community. And again, it does require regular maintenance to remove weeds. Just anecdotally from speaking to landscapers, it's thought that these systems, once they're established and in place, may actually be easier to maintain than a no-mow zone. That's because these landscaped features are just going to be edged to keep weeds from encroaching rather than being maintained and trimmed to a certain height. Okay, so a little bit more about the no-mow zones. Again, the no-mow zone is going to utilize that existing turf to create a buffer zone. It's going to allow the turf to increase in height, which in theory is going to allow the turf to grow deeper, more well-developed roots. That tall turf can act as a bit of a physical barrier to pollutants, so blocking things before they enter the stormwater system. But again, that no-mow zone does require regular maintenance to remove weeds and keep it trimmed to a height of 8 to 12 inches. And the turf may be trimmed to maintain a more manicured appearance so that it's not getting too unruly. And that's going to be done with a string trimmer. But again, it's important to use that string trimmer in a way that keeps the grass clippings out of the pond. So being aware of the rotation direction of your string trimmer so that you're shooting those grass clippings up onto the land as opposed to out in the water. Okay, so some more considerations about no-mow zone management. The most important thing to keep in mind is that communication is key. Whenever you're implementing a system like this, it's really critical to communicate this not only with other residents, but also with both your pond maintenance company and your landscape maintenance company. It's recommended to have a meeting with all of these entities together so that everybody is on the same page and everybody knows who is responsible for what. There's also often turnover among landscape companies. This can result in miscommunication between the management company, the landscape company, and the landscape technicians. So it's important that this is regularly communicated to the landscape maintenance company so that they can remember to remind their technicians about what is desired by the community. Right, so a little bit more about the landscape buffer zone, which is our other option for implementing a buffer zone. This is going to be, again, an opportunity to add more native bunch grasses around the stormwater pond. And those native bunch grasses, since they're allowed to grow much taller, usually a height of about 3 feet or so because they are decorative, those are going to be allowed to develop a much more robust root system than turf grass. Those plants may also provide some food and habitat for wildlife, particularly our pollinators and the birds that come in to eat those pollinators. While that can be expensive to install, grants may be available to assist with that. We have several grants in the area that are appropriate for stormwater pond projects. These systems can be edged to maintain a neat appearance, just like any other landscaping bed, just with some considerations. And when compared to no-mow zones, edging a landscape buffer zone may actually be easier and less likely to introduce grass clippings to a pond, which to some may be counterintuitive. And again, proper site preparation and diligent plant selection are important. It can be a little bit more of a challenge to select plants that are appropriate for a stormwater pond because of the varying water level and other site conditions. But UF IFAS Extension, Sarasota County does have resources and technical assistance to assist with this. So we do have a database of trait-based selection of stormwater pond plants, and that can be sent out to everybody who's in today's webinar as a resource after the presentation. That is a great resource. It's a large database of plants that are suitable for around stormwater ponds, and that database can be manipulated so that you can view it based on whatever you're looking for, whether that is what area of the pond certain plants grow in, their aesthetic value and color, their habitat and food value. So it's a really great resource. All right, so let's bring all of this home. It's important to manage your expectations with stormwater ponds. That's one of the things that people may have the biggest hurdle getting over is managing expectations on how these systems function and how these systems are going to look. So a lot of people prefer the look of a very sterile pond, a pond with nice short cropped turf grass right up to the edge of the water without any plants in the water, just nice open water system. Unfortunately, that sort of system is going to provide much less ecological value, and it can be pretty difficult to maintain. There may be a lot of inputs that need to be gone on with that pond to maintain that nice sterile appearance. And algae, again, is a natural part of the aquatic ecosystem. So a reasonable amount of algae should be accepted and expected, but it's not to say that algae should be allowed to overtake the entire pond surface. That is going to be indicative of an imbalance. And when there is an imbalance in algae, it's important to not look at the pond in isolation as a single system, but to look at it as part of the entire community watershed to really manage the water quality in that pond. Emergent plants can help to hide some of that algae and reduce a wave erosion. So those littoral plants are really beneficial. And if there's an appropriate amount of algae, that will often be blown by the wind to one area of the pond where it can hide among the littoral plants. It's important to remember that Florida has 2 major seasons, our rainy season and our wet season. So variation in water level is to be expected from season to season, but also from year to year based on the weather conditions and the climate conditions. And it's really critical to remember that all of the community's actions can potentially impact the quality of its water resources. So it's not going to be just residents that live directly on the waterfront that need to keep these practices in mind. It's everybody in a community because all of the water is connected to the whole community through that stormwater system. So it's really a window into the entire watershed of that particular community. And just a quick recap to bring it all together. Most community water features are stormwater ponds, not natural lakes. Stormwater ponds have two major functions: flood mitigation and water treatment. There's many things that we can all do to help reduce runoff pollution. We talked a lot about those earlier on in the presentation. Littoral zones are those shallow areas that allow for and accommodate those beneficial aquatic plants. Buffer zones are the area adjacent to the pond on the bank that are intended to minimize external pressures of the water. And no buffer zone or any landscape feature for that matter is maintenance free. Ongoing maintenance is required for whichever type of buffer zone you choose. And again, these systems are meant to be low maintenance zones, not no maintenance zones. So thank you very much. Thank you for coming to the presentation. And with that, I will end the meeting. I hope everybody enjoys the rest of your day.